Good morning. Today's message is not for you. If there is no one in your life with whom you have ever disagreed about anything in life. All right? If that's the case, if you've never had a disagreement with anybody about anything, then this isn't for you. So, take a breath, take a nap, go get another donut, whatever you need to do, this one's not for you. But if you have ever disagreed with anybody about anything, or maybe if you are in the middle of a disagreement with somebody about something, or if you anticipate that down the road you might have a disagreement at some point, then today's message might be helpful for you, because we are going to talk about disagreement, all right? And we're going to start in Romans 12. We've been in Romans 12 the last 3 weeks, so we're going to start there one more time. Romans 12:18 says, if possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. This is a great verse. Paul reminds us that Jesus' followers, God's people, are peacemakers. That's one of his kingdom virtues, that we are not people who run around looking for conflict, right? We don't walk down the street saying, who am I going to fight next? We are people who want to live at peace. We have been made at peace with God by Jesus. He allows us to be at peace with ourselves by forgiving us of our sins, and so we ought to live at peace with others. However, Paul recognizes that this is the real world, right? And this is one of the things I love about Paul's writing, is that he writes to us very practically about how to live in this world, and what Paul points out to us is it may not always be possible to live at peace with everyone, right? Sometimes peace is outside of our control. And so he says, as much as you can control it, live at peace with everyone. You see, there are some things in life that you can't control. You can't control what happens to you all of the time. You can't control the people around you. You can't make them think like you. You can't make them act like you. You can't make them do the things that you want them to do. You cannot control everything in life. And so what Paul is challenging us to do here is to focus on what we can control. Don't be controlled by what you can't control, but work at what you can. You can't control whether or not people disagree with you. People are going to disagree with you. You can't control how they disagree with you. And you can't control how they treat you when they disagree with you. But what you can control is how you disagree with them. And that's really our challenge for this morning, is to ask ourselves the question, when it comes to what I can control, how will I disagree with others while not being disagreeable to others? Here's going to be kind of our starting point for this morning. It is okay and expected for Christians to disagree with one another about politics. All right, so that's okay. It's okay if sitting here in this room right now, we have different ideas. In fact, I imagine that we do. We should expect it. This is okay. It's fine for us to disagree because we're all different. We have different ideas. But we must do so in a manner that does not harm the kingdom and does not keep people from connecting to Jesus. You see, Christians are always going to disagree. We'll see in a minute how Christians always have disagreed. The question is not whether or not we disagree. The question is, how do we do it? And we must be so careful that when we disagree, we do so in a way that first and foremost doesn't harm the kingdom of God. How many of us have seen churches ripped apart by people who couldn't agree, and sometimes on stupid things? Like, we can't agree on the color of the carpet, so let's go start 2 new churches. We can each have the carpet the color we want it, right? So we have to be careful not to do harm to the kingdom of God, and also we must be careful that in our disagreements we don't turn people away from Jesus. Because far too often people look at Jesus' followers and say, if that's how his followers behave, I want nothing to do with him. Because we are disagreeable when we disagree, instead of connecting people to Jesus, we turn them away from him. Now, throughout history, for 2,000 years, since the beginning of Christianity, Christians have had disagreements with each other. That's nothing new. In fact, if you go all the way back to the first century, to the very first generation of Christians, they had some big disagreements. One of the biggest was about this question, is it okay to eat meat that has been offered to idols? You You see, in the early days of Christianity, as it spread from Jerusalem and into the Gentile world, spread across Turkey and into Greece and into Rome, you began to have Christians who were Gentiles who had grown up their whole lives in cultures and cities that worshiped false gods. And in their worship of these false gods, they would go to the temples and they would sacrifice, and then they would take the meat that had been sacrificed to a false idol and either eat it there or they'd go to the marketplace where it would be sold. And now some of these new Christians are asking, hey, wait a minute, can I eat that meat? Because all my life I've eaten that meat, but is that okay? And some would say, no, that's not okay. Of course it's not okay. Have nothing to do with idols, have nothing to do with false gods. Why would you ever want to have anything to do with an idol or a false god? Of course you can't eat that meat. And then others would say, well, wait a minute, hold on, let's not be rash. That those idols and those false gods are not a real thing. They're fake. They're not real gods. The idols are just carved wood and carved stone, and so they're actually not meaningful. Just because that meat has been sacrificed to them doesn't mean anything because they're not real gods. And also, that meat comes from animals that are God's creation, and all of God's creation is good. God created animals so they could be food for us, and so we should just enjoy it with gratitude to God because it's His creation that He made for us, and so it's okay to eat that meat. And they would go back and forth. And this debate was waged all across Christianity. From Jerusalem to Rome, Christians were saying, is it okay to eat this meat? And so in many of Paul's letters, he actually addresses this question. One of the places is in 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians is this letter that Paul wrote where he addresses many of the questions that the church had for him. And one of the questions was, can we eat this meat? So let's look at Paul's answer. 1 Corinthians 8, verse 1, he says, now, about food sacrificed to idols, we know that we all have knowledge. What does he mean by that? We all have knowledge. Essentially, what Paul is saying is all of us know that we're right. Right? Whichever side of this debate you find yourself on, you know that you're right. You know that you've done the research, you've done the work, you've figured it out, and you're right, and your opponent is wrong. And it doesn't matter which side you're on this one, you know you're right. Because let's be honest, both sides sound pretty good, don't they? It sounds right to say, why would you want anything to do with idols? And it sounds good to say God created that meat, it's for our enjoyment, we should eat it with gratitude to Him. Both sound right. The problem is, both are right, but neither is all right. Well, what Paul is saying here is, look, we know that we all have opinions. We all have an idea of what we think is right here, and everyone is holding very tightly to their opinions and not willing to bend. And I think all of us are guilty of this, right? In fact, we could probably take this verse and change it a little bit, bring it into today, and say now about the 2024 election. We know that we all have knowledge, right? Because we do. We all know that we're right, and the other side is wrong. Or even more specific, we could do issues in the election now. About this issue of immigration, we know that we all have knowledge. About the school millage, we know that we all have knowledge. Do you see how this works? You can take any issue and plug this in, and what Paul says rings true for us just like it did then. We all have opinions. We all think we're right. And so how do we disagree well if we all have different opinions? Well, it starts, we have to understand what an opinion is. Because usually the way we think of opinions is, my opinion is rooted in this deeply held value that is biblical and like God. And there's a little bit of truthful facts sprinkled in, which makes my opinion absolutely right. And my opponent's opinion is just foolishness that they got off the internet, right? Which is why I'm right. But the reality is opinions are a lot more than that. Opinions are kind of like lasagna. There's just like a lot of layers. But once you start to eat it and it gets in your mouth, you can't really distinguish which layer is which because it's all just jumbled together, which is awesome with lasagna. But sometimes with opinions makes it hard for us to understand where our own opinions come from. You see, I have opinions. I like to think that my opinions are rooted in principles and values that I get from the Bible, right? but I know there's more to it than that. I know that my opinions also have something to do with my family, and so do yours. For some of us, we would say, well, my family has always believed this, and so I believe it. And then some of us would say, well, my family has always believed it, so I will never believe it. It kind of depends on what your family history is, right? And some of you have a great family history, so you love what your family believes. And some of you have a terrible family history, and so you completely reject it. But your family does impact your opinions on things. Your friends impact your opinions. The reality is most of us, over time, begin to look like, act like, sound like, think like the people we spend the most time with. And so who our friends are impacts our opinion. Our education impacts our opinion. Our experiences impact our opinions, right? Like, well, I tried that once, and it worked really well, so I'm sure that it will work all the time for everyone else. Well, I did that once, and it didn't work at all, so I'm sure it would never work for anyone else. You see, my experiences impact my opinions. And we could go on down the list of all the different layers that play into what our opinions are. And as much as that's true for me, it's true for the people who disagree with me. And so when we approach this question of how do we disagree well when we have these opinions that are so different, we need to understand there's two wrong approaches to this and there's one right approach. The first approach, that's the wrong approach, is to just outright dismiss someone else's opinion. And we love to do this. And the way we do it is we say, well, I've got this kind of multi-layered opinion that has a lot of nuance to it. I've done a lot of work on it. And like your opinion, well, you only believe that because fill in the blank, therefore you're wrong. Right? I just completely dismiss it without ever taking the time to understand it. That's the wrong approach to disagreement. But there's another approach that we sometimes take, which is to disappear. Right? We say this line that sounds great. It's terrible. Are you ready? Let's agree to disagree. That's not helpful for anybody. Nobody learns anything, nobody moves, nobody grows, and we just go on in this place of disagreement where it's super uncomfortable, right? Let's just agree to disagree. How about instead of dismissing and instead of disappearing, we decide to work together and try to take our opinions that start out here and say, well, how can we move closer? Maybe if we start to talk and start to listen, what we'll discover is that the layers of our opinions aren't so different, and maybe there's a lot of places we actually already agree and only a few where we don't. So to help us do that this morning, what I want to do is I want to kind of talk about two different things that I think we all need to do in order to discover each other's opinions instead of dismissing or disappearing from each other's opinions, okay? And the first is this. I want us to talk about what it looks like to resist the urge to judge. Okay, we're going to talk about that first, about resisting the urge to judge. And then we'll finish up by talking about how to embrace the awkwardness of speaking truth. Okay, so that's kind of a roadmap for where we're going. Let's go back to Romans chapter 14 now, verse 1. Paul says, "Welcome anyone who is weak in faith, but don't argue about disputed matters. One person believes he may eat anything." Now, this is actually a little bit different of a debate that Paul is addressing here. What Paul is addressing here is this argument between Gentile Christians and Jewish Christians. It's a little bit related to what's happening in 1 Corinthians. The difference here is, understand, for a Jewish Christian, they have lived their entire life before Jesus under the law of Moses. And the law of Moses had very strict guidelines on what they could and could not eat. They could not eat anything that was unclean. And so now that they have met Jesus, they're trying to wrestle with what that means for the law of Moses. Now we know in Acts, God actually made this really clear. He said to Peter, "Peter, rise and eat." And then he said, "Do not call unclean anything that God has made clean," which was God's way of saying, welcome the Gentiles into the family, but also it's okay to eat the things that were once considered unclean. So now you have in Rome, this church, where you have Gentile Christians and Jewish Christians. And the Jewish Christians are like, not sure I can eat that stuff. The Gentile Christians are like, eat whatever you want, right? Because they've always been that way. So you have one person believes he may eat anything, while one who is weak eats only vegetables. Hey, men, you might want to take that verse and post it in your house somewhere, right? One who is weak eats only vegetables. That's the Bible speaking really clearly about bacon for all of us. Okay? One who eats, so this is a Gentile, one who eats must not look down on one who does not eat. So Paul says, look, if you're the person who thinks you can eat whatever you want, don't look down on the person who doesn't think that. See, sometimes we have this tendency, we have this, I've been set free in Christ, right? I used to live a life that was full of rules, and I was bound by the law, and I was steeped in legalism. But now that Jesus has set me free, it's easy for me to look at the people who are like I used to be and look down on them. And be like, well, I'm sorry they haven't grown in the faith as much as I have. But notice what Paul is really saying here, because this is important. In this debate, it's actually the Gentiles who are right, aren't they? They're the ones who are going along with what God has taught, that don't call unclean what God has made clean. So they are right to say, we can eat anything. That's okay. But what Paul is saying is, just because you are right, you do not have the right to look down on other believers. And we have to be so careful that just because we are right, we don't look down on those who are wrong. Apply this to other areas of life, right? Like, I go to a church where, they have really great music because we've set free, and so I'm so glad I'm not in those old churches that sing the hymns, and they just need to come along and get with the times. No, we don't look down on those who see things differently than us. What about politics? I know I'm right on this issue. Right? I got the Bible behind me. I know I'm right. But just because I know I'm right, that doesn't give me the right to look down on my brother or sister. Right? Just because you know you're right, you don't get to look down on someone. Because what we're really doing when we do that is we're saying, I'm up here and you're down here, and I just need to teach you how to come up to my level. And Paul's saying, no, that's not our attitude. That's not how we disagree. But he goes on, right? He goes on and he says, and one who does not eat, so now he's talking about the Jewish believer, one who does not eat must not judge one who does. You see, when you live your life by a set of rules, it can be very easy to judge those who don't. Okay, for the Jewish people, it was dietary rules. It would have been very easy for them to judge and say, well, they're not as holy as us because they don't follow the law as well as us. And we can come up with all kinds of laws for ourselves. We all have codes of conduct that we think people should follow, and it's very easy for us to judge the people who don't. And so we have to be careful about this. Now, that word judge is tricky sometimes, because the Bible says, judge not, lest ye be judged, so we shouldn't judge. But it also says, judge rightly, so we should judge. So how does that work together? Well, pretty simply this. Sometimes when the Bible tells us to judge, it's talking about discernment. Like, I have to discern what is right and what is wrong. I have to discern what is true from what is false. And when it speaks of ideas or philosophies or arguments, and it says judge the idea, judge the philosophy, judge the argument, it's telling us to be discerning. Understand, is that right or wrong? But when it's talking about people, it says do not judge people. Why? Because that's what God does. Only God is capable of saying that person is right or that person is wrong. Now, we can discern, is that person doing something that violates God's command? But we cannot judge or condemn whether that person is right or wrong before God. Only He can do that. And so what Paul is saying here is, you've got your code of conduct that you live by. Don't condemn other believers who don't live that way. So I grew up here. This is the world that I grew up in. I grew up in a really strict fundamentalist Baptist, right? We were the ones who nobody ever went to movies. Like, the theaters were, that was the place of the devil. So we did not go to movies. And we did not listen to music that had drums in it. Or that had syncopation, if you know what that is. Like, if music made you want to move your hips a little bit, no, that was out. You know, we were in church at least 3 times a week, Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, and we wore our suit every time. And we were probably also there on Tuesday for visitation, right? And on Thursday for the work night. So we did all of this. And we believed that we were doing it right. And people who weren't doing it like us, they were doing it wrong. I remember as a child, I was a pastor's kid, so as a child, going to our denomination's big national conference, and they were having a vote in the denomination to kick a church out. And let me explain why. So let's say the church they're kicking out is Church A. Church A was being kicked out because they were not separating themselves appropriately. That's the actual terminology that we use, separation. And what that meant was, Church A is just like us. They don't go to the movies. They don't listen to bad music. They wear their suits. They go to church a lot. They follow all the rules. They're just like us. But we heard that Church A had a potluck with Church B. And at Church B, sometimes the ladies wear slacks to church. That's how we talked back then. And at Church B, we heard that one time they had a guitar player in worship, and they actually used an overhead projector to put words on a screen. Now remember, that's Church B. Church A doesn't do any of that. But because Church A had a potluck with Church B, they're gone. That was how we judged and separated. It was cancel culture long before cancel culture, right? And what Paul is saying is, look, you're going to have differences of opinion. You're going to have disagreements. Do not judge and separate just because you disagree. And here's why. It's the last phrase in the verse. He says, because God has accepted him. Now, let's put that phrase back into the verse in a couple of places to really see what Paul is saying. He says, look, one who eats must not look down on one who does not eat, because God has accepted him. And one who does not eat must not judge one who does, because God has accepted him. Understand this. We do not accept others because they agree with us. We accept others because God has accepted them. I hope that this is always a core cultural component of the gathering. I will always work to make it so, and I hope that it always stays this way, that we are a church that we disagree with each other a lot. I hope we can always be a church where there is just a ton of disagreement. Like, we can disagree about political stuff. We can disagree about the color of the carpet. We can disagree about the music and whether or not it makes us want to move our hips. We can disagree about what we wear. We can disagree about all these things. And I hope we can always be that church, because we understand that whatever it is that we may disagree on, the one thing we have in common is that God has accepted us. And God does not accept us because we agree with each other. He accepts us because of what Jesus has done for us. All right, let's keep going, because Paul gets even more intense here. Verse 4. He says, who are you to judge another household servant? Before his own Lord he stands or falls. All right, so two things that Paul does here. First of all, he directs our attention to who we are. We are servants. We are not the master. We are servants of God, every single one of us. And that person that we disagree with is a servant of God. We are not their master. They are not our master. It is not our place to judge them. It is not our place to condemn them. They must answer to their master. And so Paul reminds us, hey, you're the servant, not your job to determine who's in and who's out. But then he also does this really great thing where he reminds us to take an eternal perspective. He says, before his own Lord he stands or falls. This is a reference to the final judgment. Saying, look, that person that you disagree with, you're not their master. They will stand before the master one day. The final judgment. And what he's doing is saying, hey, look, take an eternal perspective on your temporary disagreements. Because whatever it is that you're disagreeing about right now, how much is that going to matter in eternity when you stand before God? Right? Is that big fight you had over the 2024 election really going to matter all that much when you stand before God? Is that angry discussion you had because you couldn't decide where to go out to eat really going to matter all that much when you stand before God? You see how this works? Paul says take an eternal perspective to your temporary disagreements. Now, this can be a little bit frightening. when you realize what he's actually saying here, right? Because what he's saying here is when disagreeing, we must remember that I am responsible for me, and you are responsible for you, and both of us are responsible to God. You are responsible to God. You're responsible to God for how you speak. You're responsible to God for how you act. You're responsible to God for how you treat others. You're responsible to God for how you use what he has given you, your time, your energy, your resources, your possessions. You're responsible to God for all of these things. And one day we will all stand before God, the righteous judge, and be responsible to him. That's frightening, because I know that I've not always gotten it right. So look at the second half of the verse. Paul goes on to say, and he will stand, right? Who are you to judge another's household servant? Before his own Lord he stands or falls, and he will stand because the Lord is able to make him stand. That person that you disagree with, when they stand before God, they will be able to stand not because of anything they've done, but because of what Jesus did. And you, when you stand before God, you will be able to stand not because of anything you've done, but because of what Jesus has done for you. This is pretty awesome. You see, when I stand before God at that final judgment, the reality is I've said things, I've done things that I regret. I've treated people in ways that I shouldn't have treated them. I have made mistakes. I have fallen short. But none of that matters because Jesus has done the work for me. And when I stand before God, it's because of Jesus that I can stand. No one is going to stand before God because they agreed with me. And no one is going to stand before God because they agreed with you. Your political opinion cannot make you stand at the final judgment. Please hear this. Please hear this. Your salvation has nothing to do with your vote. And nobody else's salvation has anything to do with their vote. At the final judgment, Donald Trump cannot make you stand. And at the final judgment, Kamala Harris cannot make you stand. Only Jesus can make you stand at the final judgment. So why is it that we don't judge others? Because we've been accepted by Jesus. And if they've been accepted by Jesus and I've been accepted by Jesus, I have no place to try to keep them out. Now, having said all that, let me try to bring a little bit of clarity here, okay? How we disagree is important. But what I'm not saying is that we should never disagree. I'm not saying that. In fact, I'm saying we should disagree. It's important that we disagree, but we have to do it the right way. And doing it the right way means we avoid the urge to judge, but it also means this. It means that we choose to embrace the awkwardness of telling the truth. Because telling the truth is important. Remember in the book of Acts, Peter and the disciples were brought before the Sanhedrin, the ruling council. And they were told, look, you guys have to stop talking about Jesus. Now this was a threat that had some teeth, because the Sanhedrin is the same group of people that had put Jesus to death. And so the disciples understood these people will kill us if we don't agree. But what they did is they didn't dismiss it. They didn't disappear. Peter stood up and he said, look, if we have to choose between obeying God and obeying man, we will choose to obey God. And we are going to tell the truth whatever it costs us. You see, it is important for us to be willing to tell the truth. If a person who is close to me is walking down a path that is going to be harmful for them, I need to tell them the truth. If I know someone who is falling into a place of deception, then I need to be willing to tell them the truth. If I see someone that is walking away from Jesus, then I need to be willing to tell them the truth. If I know a Christian who is behaving in a way that is harming their testimony and harming the name of Jesus, then I need to be willing to tell them the truth. And I need to do it like Jesus would. So how would Jesus do it? Well, let's go over to John chapter 1 real quick. John 1:14. It says, the Word, that's Jesus, became flesh. That's when he came to earth and dwelt among us. We observed his glory, the glory as the only one from the Father, full of grace and truth. Who is Jesus? Jesus was God come to earth. How did he live? Full of grace and truth. So when we tell the truth, how should we tell it? It should be full of grace. See, understand, if I tell the truth but lack grace, then I'm not like Jesus. So sometimes we like to excuse the way we talk by just saying, well, it's the truth. Sorry if it hurts, but it's the truth. And we have this idea that as long as what I'm saying is true, I can say it any way I want. So I can be accusatory, I can be harsh, I can be mean, I can belittle, I can be sarcastic, but hey, it's the truth, right? I'm just telling the truth. No, that's not Jesus. Jesus was full of grace and truth. So to tell the truth without grace is to not be like Jesus. But to be full of grace without truth is actually neither. Because if the truth isn't involved, then it's not gracious. If someone is in trouble or someone is in danger, and I'm like, well, I want to be gracious, so I'm not going to tell them the truth. I'm not being gracious, I'm being hateful. I must be willing to tell the truth, but I must do it with grace. So let me give you 4 questions that you can ask yourself that will help you speak the truth while exuding grace. All right? Here's question number 1. Is it true? Kind of makes sense, right? Is it true? Is what I'm really about to say, do I know that this is true? Now, we spent a lot of time last week talking about how to discern if something is true, because it's important. If I'm going to say something, I need to make sure it's true. So I may not want to come blowing into a conversation if I don't know for sure. I may want to ask some questions for clarification. I may want to make some observations, but I want to make sure that whatever it is I'm saying is actually the truth. The second question is, can I speak it kindly? Can I speak it kindly? I don't want to be the kind of person whose truth is lost because I didn't say it kindly. Jesus said that we are the salt of the earth, right? Salt brings flavor. And so when I speak the truth to someone, my words should not make them bitter, right? My words shouldn't taste bitter. Jesus also said we are the light of the world, which means that my words ought to bring light, not darkness. And so when I tell someone the truth, it's important that I don't make their life more bitter, and it's important that I don't plunge them into more darkness. I need to learn how to say it kindly. So I'm not accusatory. I don't make assumptions. My tone actually matters when I tell the truth. Is it true? Can I say it kindly? Number 3, will it be heard? Will it be heard? You know, not everybody is ready for all the truth all the time. And sometimes I can think I'm doing the right thing, but I can actually be doing a hurtful thing by speaking too much truth to someone who's not ready for the truth. Jesus said this. Jesus said, don't cast your pearls before swine. He said, don't throw your truth to someone who's not ready for it. He told his disciples when he sent them out on a mission, go into a town and preach the good news. And if they reject the good news, you shake the dust off your sandals and you go on to the next town and see if they're ready to hear the good news there. Proverbs tells us over and over again, be careful about speaking truth or wisdom to a mocker because they will laugh at you, they will scorn you. Not everybody is ready for all the truth all the time. Now, sometimes somebody's not ready for the truth because there's something going on in their life, right? And they're just not in a place where they're ready for that conversation. Or maybe there's something in their past that they're still working through. Or maybe they just don't want to hear the truth from you right now. To understand that answering this question requires me to know the person, requires me to be in relationship with the person, requires me to be sensitive to where that person is at. Do you remember one of the things we said last week? We said you don't have to say everything you think, right? Just because something pops into your mind doesn't mean you need to say it. And that principle applies here. You don't have to engage every single political debate that comes your way. You don't have to speak into every disagreement that you have. And you don't need to tell everybody every truth all of the time. You need to discern, you need to judge rightly whether this is the right time and this is the right place for me to say these words. And if it is the right time and it is the right place, and what I say is true and I can say it kindly, then it's time to move forward. But here's the 4th question to ask yourself, who will benefit from this? You see, a lot of times I tell the truth for my own benefit, right? I just got to get this off my chest, right? I just need to vent a little. I need to tell you this because you're making me so mad, right? Now, who's benefiting from this? I am, right? I'm getting it off my chest. I'm venting. I feel a lot better, right? But the person I'm talking to, they haven't benefited at all. Sometimes I tell the truth just so I can win, just so I can feel superior, just so I can level up and get above them, right? So that I can be the debate king. Sometimes I tell the truth so that others around me will be impressed. See, any of these things that I'm doing, if I'm telling the truth for my own benefit, that's selfishness. And if I'm being selfish, I'm not being gracious. I cannot tell the truth in a gracious way if I'm telling the truth for selfish reasons. And so anytime I'm ready to speak truth into someone's life, one of the most important questions for me to ask is, why am I doing this? Is this for me or is this for them? All right, so is it true? Can I say it kindly? Will it be heard? Who will benefit? And when I ask these questions, I put myself in the place, I put myself in the mindset where I can disagree with someone without being disagreeable. Where my opinions and their opinions can maybe move closer to each other because we're in a place where we're actually working together instead of fighting against each other. Let me leave you with one more encouragement here from Romans 12. Romans 12:21 says, "Do not be conquered by evil, but conquer evil with good." It feels in our world right now that evil is winning. Because it is. Right? And until Jesus comes back, it will continue to feel that way. But just because we look around ourselves and see evil winning in lots of different places doesn't mean that we can't fight for good. But when we use that word fight, we need to understand what it means. In Ephesians 6, when it's talking about the whole armor of God, we're told that we do not fight against flesh and blood. God's people don't fight other people. What we're fighting against is the ideas of the world. We're fighting against the values of the world. We're fighting against the philosophies of the evil one. And so when we say we want to conquer evil with good, we're not trying to conquer people. We're trying to conquer sin. And here's the reality. When I disagree with someone, there is an opportunity for evil to win, and there is an opportunity for good to win. If in my disagreement, I just dismiss them, say, you're obviously wrong, then evil will win. If in my disagreement, I am hateful and spiteful and angry and brash, then evil will win. The kingdom will be damaged. People will be pushed away from Jesus. But if in my disagreement, I listen, I learn, I connect, I'm gracious, I'm willing to speak the truth when the time is right, then good will conquer evil. And every single one of us will have the opportunity this week to conquer evil with good. Because this week, you are going to disagree with someone. It might be about politics. It might be about something else. But when you find yourself in that place, it's a great time to remind yourself, hey, we're disagreeing because we have different opinions. And we have different opinions because we both have different layers to our lives. And so what I need to do is not dismiss this person, not disappear from this conflict, but I need to discover who they are. I need to discover what's going on. And I need to look for an opportunity that I can graciously step into their lives and share the truth of Jesus in a way that's helpful for them and in a way that builds the kingdom. Let's look for those opportunities this week.